What's going on, guys? I'm CFB Kings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in today. It's been a minute since the last episode. I had some weather circumstances down here in the southeast last week, and I've also been pretty sick for a few days. But we're back now, and I'm ready to dive into Week 8. Before we start previewing all these games, I quickly wanted to say thank you for the support lately. Like I said, I haven't been able to do the podcast in a week, but the Twitter and Instagram pages have been pretty much business as usual, and the support over there has been awesome. Since the last time that I uploaded an episode of the show on YouTube and Spotify, we've gained over 2,000 followers on Instagram alone, and several hundred on Twitter as well. So really appreciate that. Make sure you're following over there at CFB Kings on Twitter and Instagram, and then share the podcast with your friends, family, whoever you think might be interested in a twice a week, usually, college football podcast. All right, Week 8, this is the third consecutive week that is just absolutely loaded. Week 6 was one of the best weeks we've ever had. Week 7 was amazing, and we were just a couple points away from having a few more top 10 teams lose, and now we have another awesome slate in Week 8. Number 5, Georgia, travels to number 1, Texas. This is the main event on Saturday. That'll kick off at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on ABC. Texas is a 3.5-point favorite. The over-under is 55.5, giving us an implied score of 30-26 Longhorns. This will be the third time in the last 4 weeks that we've had a matchup between AP top 5 opponents, and this one, like the rest, has some massive implications, not only for the conference race in the SEC, but also the college football playoff. According to the ESPN FPI, Texas has a 76.3% chance to win this game, and that's just wild to see Georgia going into a game with a 23.7% chance to win. And after coming into this season as the number 1 team, winning 2 of the last 3 national titles, coming off the 60-point bowl win last year, there's just this feeling around Georgia now that they're actually a true underdog in this game. And for the first time in several years, I think the majority of people are going to pick them to lose. Georgia had the close call with Kentucky, then they had the loss to Alabama. They had one of their best wide receivers get suspended. Then they had this kind of strange performance last week against Mississippi State, where they allowed 31 points to a team with 1 win. Kirby Smart also kind of shoved the quarterback, Mississippi State's quarterback, on the sideline, and it has really just been an odd month in Athens. Texas is coming off a 34-3 beatdown of Oklahoma last week. Quinn Ewers is back at quarterback after missing a couple games with an abdominal strain. The Longhorns held their number 1 spot in the AP poll, which we'll talk about more in a bit. I don't believe they should be number 1, and I'll tell you why in a second, but now they have a major matchup with the number 5 Georgia Bulldogs coming to town to Austin. This game is an interesting one in that, and no offense to the teams and programs that they've played, but this is Texas's first real test, and I've been vocal about it on social media over the past few weeks, but Michigan was a pretender. They were number 10 at the time of the game, but it's clear now that this is a rebuilding season for the Wolverines. Oklahoma doesn't have their top 5 wide receivers. Mississippi State's having a really rough year, and then UTSA, Colorado State, and UL Monroe as their group of 5 opponents. Going back to Oklahoma, that wasn't an exaggeration. The Sooners are quite literally missing their top 5 wide receivers right now. Deion Burks, Nick Anderson, Jalil Farouk, Andrell Anthony, and Jaden Gibson. Anderson, Farouk, Anthony, and Gibson were wide receivers 2, 3, 4, and 5 for Oklahoma last year, accounting for 2,300 receiving yards and 18 touchdowns. And then Deion Burks is a transfer from Purdue, who was supposed to be their wide receiver 1 this season, and he's missed a lot of time as well. So Texas has faced a severely downgraded Michigan squad from what we've seen in Ann Arbor over the past couple of years. They've played an Oklahoma team that's starting a true freshman at quarterback without his top 5 receiving targets, the last place team in the SEC and Mississippi State, and then 3 group of 5 teams. And the thing about Michigan and Oklahoma is that their struggles are both on offense. Michigan switched between 3 quarterbacks, trying to find some production there, and Oklahoma, like I said, is missing their 5 wide receivers and are already kind of on their backup quarterback, or at least their second option at quarterback. So Texas really hasn't faced a high-powered or threatening offense at any point in the season, and this is where I think Georgia might have the edge going into Saturday night's game. Georgia's defense faced Clemson, who's averaging 41 points per game. They faced Alabama, who's averaging 41.7 points per game. and those offenses are ranked 10th and 12th respectively. So Texas's offense is ranked 7th, but Georgia's had a little bit of experience against teams with similar talent in Clemson and Alabama. Texas's defense, however, hasn't faced an offense in the top 70 yet. These are the rankings of the offenses that they've faced so far. Mississippi State is ranked 71st. Oklahoma is 96th. Michigan is 102nd. UL Monroe and UTSA are actually tied for 105th. And then Colorado State's right behind them at 107th. 71st, 96th, 102nd, 2 tied for 105th, and then 107th. 0 offenses in the top 70, and just 2 offenses in the top 100. And you can say, well, yeah, those offenses are averaging lower points because of the low number that they put up against Texas, but Clemson scored 3 on Georgia, or Georgia held Clemson to 3, and Clemson's still averaging 41 points per game. So if those offenses that Texas faced were any good, then that would kind of show up when they weren't facing Texas. So the biggest key to this game is if Texas's defense, and specifically their secondary, can hold up against an offense that, to put it plainly, can actually move the ball and score. Carson Beck's coming off a 459 passing yard game last week. That's the 3rd most in a game in Georgia history, and the most in a Georgia game since 1994. Now, despite all of that, I do believe that Texas has the better team. I picked Texas to win the SEC championship before the season. I picked them to be the number 1 seed in the college football playoff, and I also predicted Georgia to lose multiple games. I don't think this Georgia team is quite where they have been over the past couple of years, or where they need to be in order to win in Austin on Saturday night. I think the home field advantage for Texas will be significant, and I'll roll with the Longhorns to win this game. All right, real quick before we get to the other games, I wanted to talk about the current AP rankings and specifically the top 2. I tweeted this out on Sunday right after the poll was released, but from my perspective, there's no reason that Oregon shouldn't be number 1 right now. And after I tweeted that out, I was bombarded with responses of, it doesn't matter, who cares, it's just the AP poll, it's only October, stuff along those lines. But one, I just think accuracy is important, and taking into account the games that Oregon's played and the games that Texas has played should matter. And 2, this might actually matter a lot more than most people know right now or care to look into. But if you're watching on YouTube, you can see. But if you're listening on podcast, wins over current top 25 teams, Oregon has 2, Texas has 1. Wins over current top 15 teams, Oregon has 2, Texas has 0. And wins over current top 5 teams, Oregon has 1, Texas has 0. Strength of schedule, Oregon is 35th right now, Texas is 82nd. And then strength of record, Oregon is 1st, Texas is 6th. And if you don't know what strength of record is, it's a metric that basically measures how the average top 25 team would fare against a given schedule. So according to ESPN's system, Oregon at 6-0 with wins over Boise State and Ohio State, they've done the best that anyone can do so far. These resumes between Texas and Oregon aren't even remotely close, and the thing that got me was that just 6 of the 62 AP voters had Oregon number 1, 6 of them. And like I said before, Texas hasn't played a team with an offense in the top 70. They've played a team at Michigan who's used 3 quarterbacks trying to find some semblance of production. They've played Oklahoma, who's missing every starting wide receiver. And then every group of 5 team that they faced has an offensive ranking in the 100s. Oregon has a win over the Heisman frontrunner, Ashton Genty, and the current number 15, Boise State. And that was something that a lot of people used against Oregon, was that they only beat Boise State by 3. Like, Boise State isn't a top 15 team. They're number 15 in the AP poll right now. And people were trying to knock Oregon for having a close game with Boise State. That's better than any win Texas has. And that's their bad win, or one of their close calls. But, yeah, they have a win over, quote-unquote, the best team money can buy, the best Ohio State roster ever, $20 million spent in NIL. And even after the loss to Oregon, the Buckeyes are still number 4. So Oregon has a top 4 win right now. Another response I got, kind of along the lines of Oregon struggling with Boise State and that being a quote-unquote bad win over a top 15 team, was that, well, Texas has looked dominant in every game so far. And they have. That's true in most of them. They struggled a little bit with Mississippi State in the first half, but that ended up being like a 3-touchdown victory. So I think they've beat every team by 15-plus points. But yeah, and Texas has looked dominant, but I'd hope so, against those teams. Like I said, no offense in the top 70. They're facing teams who struggle to score, and not just against them, against the other teams that they play too. And Oregon has also dominated inferior competition as well. Like they beat Oregon State by 35, they beat UCLA by 21, they beat Michigan State by 21. And the reason that this can matter later is for college football playoff seeding. And like I said before, just being accurate in the present matters, and Oregon has done far more to earn that number one spot than Texas has. But also because AP rankings affect the College Football Playoff Committee. The CFP rankings, which are first released on November 5th, so we've got about 3 weeks on those, but those are the ones that really matter. But you're kidding yourself if you think that the members of the committee aren't thinking about the AP ranking that they've seen next to these teams' names every single week for 2 months leading up to their first meeting. And now you might be wondering, well, why does the CFP seeding matter? You know, if you get into the college football playoff, that's all that matters. You have a shot. And that's true, but there's also some advantages built into the college football playoff seeding. The reason that the seeding matters is because the locations of the college football playoff games this year are potentially very, very critical, specifically for Texas, but also where the other semifinal game is. And the number one seed in the college football playoff, if you don't know, they get to pick the location of their semifinal game if they get past the quarterfinals. The college football playoff semifinals this season are in Arlington, Texas, and Miami, Florida. Which location do you think number one seed Texas would pick if they won their quarterfinal? They will literally get to play in their backyard in Arlington, basically Dallas, in the Cowboys Stadium. So talking about AP rankings and saying who cares or it doesn't matter quickly turns into Texas getting a semifinal game in their home state and Oregon having to travel as far as physically possible to Miami, Florida. And you know who's in contention for the CFP this year, who could very well be in a semifinal game? The Miami Hurricanes. There is a very real possibility that the Canes could get a home semifinal game in the Orange Bowl, the bowl game, in Miami. And that could be a true road game for whoever has to go there. And in this scenario, that would be Oregon. So not only would they have to cross the entire width of the United States, they would be playing a road game, a true road game in their opponent's stadium, if everything worked out to the point where it was Miami as their opponent. So it's obviously a very specific scenario, but that's why it could matter. So obviously there's a lot of season left. It is October. The committee may end up having Oregon first in their rankings anyway, but my argument for the AP poll and AP voters is that if Oregon isn't in front of Texas now, with a vastly better resume, with 2 top 15 wins compared to Texas's 0, against a tougher overall schedule with a better strength of record, how would they ever jump them if they both win out? And a lot of people were commenting, well, this will just decide itself with the Texas-Georgia game, implying that if Texas beats Georgia, they should stay at number 1, and if they lose, Oregon will move up. But the thing is, even if Texas beats Georgia, Oregon would still have the better resume. That's how far apart they are right now. So Texas would have a win over number 5 Georgia, and then a Michigan team who doesn't deserve to be ranked but is, and then Oregon would have wins over number 4 Ohio State and number 15 Boise State. They would still have higher ranked wins and a tougher strength of schedule. So that's my speech. Just saying who cares or it doesn't matter quickly could become Oregon having to travel the entire width of the country to Miami, Florida in a college football playoff semifinal where there's a decent chance that they could have a literal true road game against the Canes while Texas plays a couple hours from their campus in Arlington. And my problem with that is that Oregon clearly has the better resume right now. They have the stronger case. And even if Texas beats Georgia on Saturday, unless it's by like 20, the Ducks would still be more deserving of being number 1. And they aren't even there right now. So there's a lot more than meets the eye there. A lot of people just say it's the AP, it doesn't matter, all that sort of stuff. But if you actually look into it, if you take into account that the CFP committee is 100% influenced by AP rankings, and that's been shown for a decade, Texas being number 1 could have some serious implications for both teams. Seriously good for Texas and seriously bad for Oregon, when I believe that Oregon has earned the right to be number 1 right now. All right, back to Week 8's games. Number 7 Alabama travels to Knoxville to take on number 11 Tennessee. The last time these two met in Neyland, it was one of the best games in college football history. It was one of Tennessee's biggest wins ever and was just a phenomenal game. The Vols won that one 52-49 on a walk-off field goal. The fans took the goalposts and threw them out into the river, and it was just a wild scene on that night in 2022. This game has the potential to be just as chaotic, just as energized. There probably won't be as many points as the 2022 version, but this one will be an awesome matchup on Saturday afternoon. They kick off at 3:30 p.m. Eastern on ABC. Alabama's a 3-point favorite. The over-under is 56.5. Implied score of 30-27 tied, a very similar projection to that of Georgia and Texas. Both teams have been on very, very unsteady ground lately. Alabama, of course, lost to Vanderbilt. Tennessee lost to Arkansas, and then both almost lost again last week. Alabama survived a wild 27-25 game with South Carolina, and Tennessee needed overtime to beat a Florida team that lost their starting quarterback and running back in that game. And that's actually back-to-back weeks where Tennessee's opponent has lost their starting quarterback, and the Vols nearly lost both times. I mentioned it in the last episode in the Week 6 recap, but Tennessee's offense against formidable defenses that aren't Kent State or Chattanooga, it really hasn't been super efficient lately. And this was a Florida defense who Miami hung 41 points on in the Swamp, and the Vols, for a second consecutive week, were shut out in the first half. And they had 0 points until under 3 minutes in the third quarter as well. So, and the same can be said for Alabama's defense against teams that aren't Western Kentucky or USF or Wisconsin. They gave up 34 to Georgia, 40 to Vanderbilt, and now 25 to South Carolina last week. In that game against South Carolina, if Lenora Sellers doesn't just launch one to the moon for no reason on their final drive, he had a guy wide open in the left flat who he could have got it to, and if that guy turned up where he had a blocker, he could have easily gotten the Gamecocks into field goal range, and that was a hair from being a 28-27 win for South Carolina. This is a huge game, of course, for both teams to really find themselves, to kind of get back on track and get back to where they were earlier in the season and get some confidence moving forward, because the loser is almost certainly out of the SEC championship race, and barring some chaos because they both already have a conference loss, that would put them at 2 losses, and they would have the head-to-head loss against the others. So, and then even the 12th-team college football playoff could be on the line, particularly for Tennessee, because they're already number 11, and that would put them in a situation where they have to beat Georgia in Athens to have any chance. Prediction-wise, this one's always hard to get a feel on, but Alabama's won 16 of the last 17 over Tennessee. However, in matchups where both teams are in the AP Top 15, Tennessee's won 5 of the last 6. So when both teams are doing pretty well, Tennessee's been the winner more often than not by a pretty significant margin. So I think this game will have a similar feel to the 2022 one. I think that crowd in Neyland will be insane, but the difference in this game for me is Jalen Milroe against Nico Iamaleava. I think Iamaleava will be a phenomenal quarterback down the road. Over the past couple weeks, he's been a little shaky, and so is Milroe, to be fair. But Milroe has more experience in these types of games, and I think he'll end up making one more play to pull out a win for the Crimson Tide. Number 6, Miami travels to Louisville for a massive one in the ACC. This one's at noon Eastern on ABC. Quite a day for that network, by the way. All of these games are on ABC on Saturday. Miami, Louisville at noon, Alabama, Tennessee at 3:30, and Georgia, Texas at 7:30. Just a ridiculous slate there. But yeah, the Canes are a 4.5-point favorite. Over/under is 61.5. Implied score of 33-29. Miami. Louisville's 4-2 and currently unranked, but their 2 losses are by 7 on the road to number 12 Notre Dame and by 7 to current number 21 SMU. So somehow Michigan's ranked, though, at number 24 with a blowout loss to Texas and a 10-point loss to 3-loss Washington. So but that's besides the point. The Cardinals earned a solid win over Virginia on the road last week, and Miami was resting up during a bye week after their cross-country trip to Cal. This one's going to be really interesting in terms of Tyler Shuck navigating through Miami's pass rush. And the key to Louisville winning this game is, number 1, no turnovers, but number 2, their offensive line has a tall task in holding off Ruben Bain, Tyler Barron, Simeon Barrow, Elijah Alston, Francisco Mawinoa, Akeem Mesidor. The Canes just have guy after guy who can get to the quarterback. If Louisville's going to win this game, they have to keep Shuck clean. And they have to give him enough time to get the ball downfield to Ja'Cory Brooks and Colin Lacey and Chris Bell. and running back Isaac Brown's going to need to be sharp, not only with the ball in his hands, but also picking up blocks and being an available check down option for Shuck when needed. I think this will be a really tight game. I think Louisville is an underrated team, and like I mentioned before, they're 4-2, but those are 2 losses by 1 score to ranked teams, and both games that they really could have won. So, unfortunately for the Cardinals, though, their schedule has been a brutal one over the past month, and really for the next month as well, and that continues on Saturday with a team that I personally have ranked number 3. I think Miami goes up to Louisville to a hostile environment. I think they win this game, and I think they keep their unbeaten season alive. Number 8 LSU travels to Arkansas. That's 7 p.m. Eastern on ESPN Saturday night. The Tigers are just a 2.5-point favorite over the Razorbacks. Over-under is 55.5, implied score of 29-27 LSU. So 2.5-point favorite for a top 10 team against an unranked opponent. This game has a very similar feel to it for the Razorbacks in what they were able to do against Tennessee just 2 weeks ago. LSU's coming off the wild overtime win over Ole Miss last week. They're in the top 10 now at number 8, and now they have a major trip to Fayetteville. This game's an interesting one in terms of SEC standings because LSU's only losses to USC. They're unbeaten in conference play. And Arkansas has losses to Oklahoma State and then to Texas A&M. So between these two, there's only one SEC loss despite the 3 total that they have. And there's a ton on the line in terms of the SEC championship race, including for Arkansas, which I think a lot of people might not really realize. I mean, if you think about it, Arkansas has 1 conference loss in a game that they led for basically all of regulation against current number 14, Texas A&M. Then they have the head-to-head win over Tennessee. And then after Saturday, they could potentially have the head-to-head over LSU as well, with them both sitting at 1 conference loss. So this is a massive tipping point for both programs and a game that could be really exciting. All right, a couple other notable matchups. Nebraska travels to number 16 Indiana. The Hoosiers are a 6.5-point favorite, over-under of 50.5, implied score of 29-22 Indiana. Really intriguing game to see Indiana play a formidable opponent. A chance for them to state their case as a contender. So far up to this point, it's kind of felt like, okay, Indiana's undefeated. Rourke's been great at quarterback, but they've played a strength of schedule ranked 113th. Their strength of schedule is currently ranked behind Sam Houston, Rice, UTEP, UMass, Ohio, Wyoming, Georgia State, North Texas, just to name a few. 113th. This week feels like a big chance for Indiana to say, yeah, we can legitimately compete and finish in the top group or the top third of the Big Ten standings. And then in the same way for Nebraska as well. They have just the 1 loss to Illinois. They're 5-1. And for Matt Rule and Dylan Raiola and that squad, this is a chance for them to get back into the rankings, to get back into the conversation too. Virginia travels to number 10 Clemson. An interesting game with Virginia head coach Tony Elliott, formerly Clemson's co-offensive coordinator for many years, making his first trip back. Virginia's starting running back, Kobe Pace, was at Clemson. Tight end Sage Ennis was at Clemson. Defensive back Malcolm Green was there as well. And all transferred to Virginia over the past couple seasons. This game has a 3-touchdown spread, but Anthony Calandri at quarterback is electric for Virginia. He presents a really interesting dual-threat challenge for that Clemson defense. And then just the mental game, too, with Tony Elliott knowing so much about Clemson and vice versa, the Tigers defense knowing so much about what he likes to do offensively. All that sort of stuff could make this an interesting one in Death Valley. A few other games to put on the radar. Number 12 Notre Dame goes down to Atlanta to take on Georgia Tech. This game's actually at Mercedes-Benz Stadium instead of a true home game for Georgia Tech, but yeah, it's like 5 minutes down the road. Notre Dame's in a situation, though, where they have to win out to have a good shot at the college football playoff, and this Georgia Tech team can really put up a solid fight. The Jackets are 5-2. Their only losses are on the road to Syracuse by 3 and on the road to Louisville by 12. And that's a very deceptive 2-possession margin. They really could have had that one against Louisville, but definitely a game that Tech can win despite being a double-digit underdog. Number 24 Michigan travels to number 22 Illinois. I've made my thoughts known about Michigan being ranked, but this is an opportunity for both teams to get back on track. Illinois gave up 49 points to 1-win Purdue last week. That's a Purdue team who I think is 1-5. They lost to Notre Dame 66-7. and Illinois needed overtime to win by a point last week, 50-49. And then Michigan had a bye week after their 10-point loss to Washington. And should be a tight, competitive game and just a rebound opportunity for both of them. We also have games like Arizona State at Cincinnati, a fun one in the Big 12 between the current number 5 and number 6 teams in conference standings, both looking to prolong some Big 12 title hopes. That's at noon Eastern on Saturday on ESPN+. I also wanted to briefly touch on Florida State at Duke on Friday night. This game's intriguing because this could be the first time ever that the Blue Devils beat Florida State. Duke is 0-22. 0-22 all-time against the Noles, and only one of those 22 games was decided by one possession. So they've really never even been all that close to earning a win over Florida State. But this may be the season because they're actually favored to do so by 3 points on Friday night. Manny Diaz has the Blue Devils at 5-1, and they have a huge opportunity to make some program history there this week, as well as already get bowl eligible. So just a big opportunity all around there for Duke. All right, a couple picks for this week. I didn't get the chance to update the record during week 7 since we missed 2 episodes, but the record is now 37-21 on the year. 8-7 last week, unfortunately, but on the bright side, that is now 8 consecutive weeks, every single week of the season, without being under 500. We're hitting at about a 64% rate right now. No sub 500 weeks, so not losing anything, but I'd really like to get back over that 70% mark. I also wanted to preface, as usual, by saying that if you don't wager or invest any money into these games, I'd recommend just keeping it that way. But if you do, be smart about it. Don't buy into all the contrived nonsense that's out there. Don't pick based on emotion. Don't pick based on only what you want to happen, all that good stuff. But if you don't do it yourself, but maybe just find it interesting, stick around for a few minutes, and if you don't want to hear about it at all, feel free to check out now. First up, I've got Florida's money line against Kentucky. Even with the loss of Graham Mertz at quarterback, if you missed that, he tore his ACL and is out for the season, and I don't believe he has any eligibility left, so that's probably the last that we'll see of Graham Mertz in college football unless he gets some sort of waiver for a 7th year. But unlike last season, though, where they lost him and then didn't really have a go-to option behind him, now they have DJ Lagway as the full-time starter. So their defense is playing better. They had every opportunity to beat a top 10 team on the road in Tennessee last week, and I think they'll bounce back with a win over Kentucky in the Swamp. I have Texas Tech -6.5 against Baylor. The Red Raiders are coming off a bye week, and under Joey McGuire, they're 2-0 after bye weeks. I thought very highly of Texas Tech coming into the year, still do, and they're currently leading the Big 12 with Iowa State and BYU. So I think they'll beat Baylor by 7+ points on Saturday. This next one's pretty specific. I have Colorado at Arizona, neither team reaching 35 points. So far this season, in 5 of Colorado's 6 games, neither team has scored 35+ in regulation. They did score 38 on Baylor, but they needed a Hail Mary and then a touchdown in overtime for that to happen. So, they had 24 with like a couple seconds left. And then in 4 of Arizona's last 5 games, neither team hit 35 points. They did give up 41 to BYU, but that also included a pick 6 with a minute left to go from 34 to 41. So that was one that caught my eye. Very specific, but Colorado at Arizona, neither team scoring 35+ points. Next up, I have NC State's team total under 17.5 points on the road at Cal. They have to cross the entire width of the United States and then face one of the stingiest defenses in the country. Cal held Miami, who currently has the number 1 offense in college football, scoring 47.7 points per game, to 18 points through the first 50 minutes of that game. Then they just had a wild fourth quarter, a couple questionable calls that led to Miami coming back. But then last week they held Pitt to 17 points. Pitt currently has the 13th best offense in the country, scoring 40.8 points per game. They lost 17-15, but defense did its job. Cal also turned over Auburn 5 times in Jordan Hare earlier in the year. And then NC State's really just struggled offensively so far. Grayson McCall went out at quarterback with a brutal injury twice, once against Wake Forest and then once, I think, in week 3. But, they trailed Clemson 52-7 before the Tigers put their backups in They scored 10 points on Tennessee. They scored 24 on Northern Illinois, and they had 17 on Syracuse. So I think the travel distance and teams who have crossed the country have really, really struggled this year. And I think the travel combined with NC State's offensive struggles and Cal's defensive efficiency, I like NC State's team total under 17.5. I will undoubtedly find a few more, but make sure you're following on Twitter. I put a full list of all the picks every week, Saturday morning. So that's where the overall record is derived from. But that's going to wrap up this episode of the show. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube. We're almost to 500 subscribers, which is a pretty big milestone. And follow if you're listening on Spotify. And like I said, definitely make sure to follow at CFB Kings on Twitter and Instagram as well for all things college football. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.